Journey with me through the emotional experience of love, devotion, and ultimate heartbreak in raising my son with significant disabilities. This is a collection of memoirs that capture a life well lived. I hope it inspires, I hope it teaches, and I hope it entertains. Thank you for joining me. Danny was tube fed from day one. He was never not tube fed. He had an NG tube inserted right from the day one in NICU. I had a really hard time with the decision to place a permanent feeding tube. It's difficult to describe why, except that I remember feeling guilty for needing to mark and scar up his stomach. In some ways, it was the look of it and making people nervous, although the NG tube also did that. The difference with the NG tube is I got to the point of inserting and taking out the tube often throughout the day. So I wouldn't say it was done with every feed, because I probably didn't do it with every feed, but it began to be, he didn't have much of a gag, so it wasn't something that he fought and had much of a problem with. I also wanted to mention that there were many times when, because he didn't have a gag, I could very easily slip the NG tube down his throat. And it would go down a lot more smoothly and with a lot more resistance than the nose. Now obviously that's not the case for every kid, but he really minded the nose. And so his tube would go in and out of his mouth. And although obviously having a tube in your child's face brings attention, and not the kind of attention that you want people to have towards your new baby. And so I could choose to remove it if he wasn't receiving a feed and we had to be somewhere, to the store or out somewhere. The feeding tube in the stomach, in addition to making me feel bad that he would have, pain and scarring in the area, I also felt like it would cause people to reject him in the way that they would be nervous. They wouldn't want to hurt him. They wouldn't want to bump it or hurt it. And so they would avoid holding him. And so that was a fear of mine. So I put off a feeding tube for a good 2 years. So 2 years, we continued the business of placing feeding tubes, either NG nasal tubes or oral gastric through the mouth, all day, and certainly in the early days all night. And I feel like it came to me as a forced decision at one point. Obviously around 2 years old. Well, leading up to that, he'd started to vomit. And so it would often be the case that if we decided to remove the tube, the feed would come behind the tube. It would cause a reflex and he would vomit the feed. And clearly just keeping the tube in wasn't an option. It had to be replaced. And so even with that, I postponed the procedure of the surgery for the G-tube until I came upon him having thrown up and aspirated his vomit. So he was face down in the pool of vomit. He had breathed it in, he had aspirated and stopped breathing. So I picked him up and I gave him mouth to mouth. I cleaned it out. He took a deep breath. And yeah, we went to the hospital and he got a feeding tube put in. We did the PEG tube, so it's less invasive. I think most kids have that done nowadays. They just go in, I think mostly it's general anesthetic, but they, instead of making a cut in the belly, they go in orally with camera and puncture out the tube in the stomach. We found that caring for the site, the stoma at the entrance of the G-tube, can pose many challenges. It takes a full year for it to heal properly. There's a lot of granulation tissue that will grow around the site. Parents are supported and directed and educated to use chemicals to get rid of some of the granulation tissue. We didn't find that terribly helpful. In the end, what we eventually found, probably after a lot of trial and error, was washing the area with soap and water first. Although that sounds really simple, a lot of people want to avoid it, and perhaps I did as well. Cleaning it with soap and water, thinking that maybe it would hurt or it'd be contraindicated. In any event, it's actually the best thing. So soap and water, rinse it really well, of course, dry it really well once out of the tub. And we found zinc cream. We would buy a container of it specifically for a tube. We would write tube on it and only insert Q-tips, try to keep it from being dirty and contaminated. And at bath time, we would put zinc around the stoma of the feeding tube site. It did take time, like I said, about a year. We actually had to change his site at some point in his life, and so we had to start all over again. And again, that took about a year to really heal, to really make a good hole and cover up and heal for the G-tube. We had tried many G-tubes along the way. We found for us the Baird worked really well. It lasted a lot of years. Over time, they came out with a G-tube button that could be replaced by parents and caregivers, so we opted for that eventually. And in the end, that's how he received his nutrition, was through the button that we could change. When we first started, of course, we did baby formula, and at some point I became educated around the benefits or lack thereof of cow's milk. So I opted to not use cow's milk, and we went right to infant tube feeding formula, and right into baby food. So although he was always tube fed, there were days early on when I remember I used to try and feed him baby food in his mouth just to make sure, and in case he could do it and enjoy it, even though it wouldn't sustain his nutrition. However, as time went on, he aspirated, and it became obvious that he wasn't going to be able to take anything by mouth. So what I went to for quite a few years is mixing and blending together baby food. And so I would buy baby food, tons and tons of baby food, and mix it. I do believe it went into a blender so that any particles that were left in some of the baby food with pulp would have been easy liquefiable. And so I would blend it in the blender, strain it through a strainer, mix it with water oftentimes, and we would feed blended whole food, real food diet for years. That moved on over time from baby food to, if it was appropriate, and by appropriate I mean it would easily break down to a liquid. The suppers that I cooked, he would get the supper that I cooked that would get blended and strained and pushed into his tube. Otherwise, he would have formula, tube feeding formula. Also, eventually they came out with a tube feeding formula that was made with real food. And so we would go back and forth between real food that I would buy and then the blended food formula. I do have some old diets that I'd be happy to pull up and share with anybody if anybody wanted to have further discussion on that. But generally speaking, we would do things like in the morning he would have cream of wheat. It was particularly easy to strain, liquefy, I guess. We would mix that with plain yogurt. Sometimes I would get the vanilla because it had more calories in it. Lunch would be things like soup. Certain crackers would blend well. Certain fruit would blend well. I often had to find a source of empty calories. And when you make real food blended down, it's often hard to reach the amount of calories that you need. So I would find cookies. Caramel cakes were particularly easy to break down in the blender and strain. And I would add that also to normally his lunch. And supper would be, like I said, anything that I would have for supper. So whether it was chicken and potatoes or fish and rice. I didn't find rice particularly easy. I tried to stick more to potatoes and other root vegetables in terms of tube feedings. I believe that's what helped keep him as healthy for as long as it did. And yeah, I'd be happy to have more discussions about tube feeding as well.